everyone, welcome back to another In Brief video. So today I'm going to tackle a topic that a lot of people have brought up, which is Paul within Judaism and the sort of Paul within Judaism school of interpretation, and just give my thoughts on it, both appreciative and also critical. So what I thought I'd do is start with 5 common features of the Paul within Judaism school. There's a diverse lot of people involved in this particular school of interpretation that do different things. And so I want to be kind of clear about that up front. But what I've found are kind of 5 common features. But before I kind of get into that, I want to run through kind of a list of scholars who are key proponents of this school of interpretation. Some of them you may know, especially those who asked me to make this video. The key ones that come to mind for me, and obviously there are many more, would be Paula Fredrickson, Matthew Novenson, Mark Nanos, John Gager, Stanley Stowers, Lloyd Gaston, Pamela Eisenbaum. If you've heard these scholars' names or have read their works before, this is kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about Paul within Judaism. I am going to be leaning on Paula Fredrickson's insights in particular. I know there is disagreement within this particular camp, but I think drawing from her work and her kind of summaries of Paul within Judaism, it seems like from my research that these are kind of common threads among these figures, although there's going to be different ways. And you'll see once I get into questions of soteriology, I'll kind of flag up how there's clear disagreement on that point in particular. So the first common feature is that Paul, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, never left Judaism and never thought of his mission to the pagans as somehow separate from his Judaism. So Paul didn't sort of convert out of or away from Judaism into something else, something we might call Christianity, right? And so Paul needs to be interpreted for this crowd. I'm going to refer to them as PWJ for the sake of brevity. Within this PWJ camp, Paul needs to be interpreted in the context of mid-first century diaspora Judaism, and especially the social context of its synagogues. So 2, for the PWJ approach, Paul's message was really all about the idea that history was coming to an end soon, and that God would soon establish his kingdom through his son, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So Jesus' resurrection indicates the nearness of this event. So there's a lot of pressure coming for the PWJ crowd, coming from the idea that Paul was expecting the impending return of Jesus, where Jesus would defeat death, would battle and defeat false gods, the dead would be raised, and all of Israel would finally be ingathered. And along with this, all the nations turning from idols to the one true God. And for the PWJ crowd, this is an emphatically Jewish message all the way through. 3, while this message was thoroughly Jewish, Paul didn't expect pagans to convert to Judaism. In fact, he warned against pagans being circumcised. The Torah is for Israel, not the nations. So Paul himself would have remained fully Torah observant. Pagans were only expected to turn away from their idols to worship the one God of Israel, which in some sense recapitulates the covenant as encapsulated in the beginning of the Decalogue. So for the PWJ crowd, what Paul was teaching the pagans was hardly law-free. He was asking them to conform their behavior to certain standards of the Jewish law, especially to do with idolatry, but without requiring them to convert to Judaism wholesale in order to be saved. So feature 4, there are a couple different directions you can run with this soteriologically. The first, or A, is to say that while the culmination of God's purposes only happens through the Messiah, Jesus, Israel is already adopted as God's sons, but pagans or Gentiles need to be reformatted by the Spirit in order to be included as adoptees. But Jews are not saved apart from the agency of God's Messiah. A remnant of Israel, chosen by God, stands as a sign that soon the fullness of the nations will be integrated, at which point the rest of Israel, who are presently broken off, will be returned, and all Israel will be saved. So it's coming out of Romans 9 through 11 in particular. Or, so the other kind of direction that this can go, and I'm thinking Eisenbaum in particular, is that, and obviously there are lots of precursors to Eisenbaum on this. This is often referred to as the Zonderweg approach, which is the two ways of salvation. God is offering two ways of salvation. One for Jews as being involved in an already established, irrevocable covenant with God, and a second separate way for pagans through Christ and the Spirit to be saved. Now, the fifth kind of feature is key importance for the Jerusalem temple and synagogues for Paul's mission on the ground. For the PWJ crowd, since there is evidence of lots of pagans, in particular God-fearers, you get this a lot in the book of Acts, being interested in showing respect for the Jewish God already in Paul's day. To quote Paula Fredrickson, Paul need not have ventured outside these synagogues. Paul need not have ventured outside these synagogues, end quote. So there's an emphasis on Paul's work within synagogue communities here as crucial for understanding Paul, for the growth of his message, even when he wasn't expecting pagans to be circumcised or to convert fully to Judaism. So I think the key point, just to sum things up, is that Paul's message and mission need to be understood for the PWJ crowd within the bounds of late Second Temple Judaism. So this is sort of a brief summary of Paul within Judaism. Now, before getting into some more critical things, I want to say what I appreciate about the Paul within Judaism approach. The first is, I think it's important to know right off the bat that Paul is a Jew, and his enduring commitment to Judaism is shot through his letters. And in particular, that Paul was a first century Jew. Okay? So yes, it is important to bear in mind and to bring into conversation when we're interpreting the Pauline data what we know about first century Judaism. Of course, that's what historians should be doing with Paul, instead of thinking about him as basically a Christian. Two, the importance that Jews in Christ were not expected to or asked to abandon their practices. This, I think, leads to disastrous, and has led to disastrous results, where Judaism is effectively erased, and then Gentiles essentially supersede them in a lot of the ways that Paul gets talked about. Once you erase Judaism and Jewish practices, the sort of dominant culture kind of takes over, in some ways colonizes that situation. So it's a wonderful thing that the Paul within Judaism school is pushing back against kind of the older readings that say, Jews who are in Christ, who are responding to Christ, really just need to abandon the Jewish practices in order to become true Jesus followers. Okay? So I think that's important. And I've talked about this before in previous videos. 3, and a point of major agreement with the Paul within Judaism crowd. I didn't really talk about this in my summary, but what these scholars are doing in their interpretation, whether explicitly or implicitly, is rejecting, at least tentatively, and overcoming the failures of the new perspective on Paul, especially to do with the new perspective's idea that Jews in Paul's day were essentially racist, or at least too balkanized, so refusing to share the law, take it to the world, that sort of thing. I have a video on an apocalyptic account of the new perspective where I talk about this in more depth. So within that, Paul's gospel sort of allows you to break through the sort of Jewish racism, or at least, ethnocentrism, or refusing to share the law with the nations. This needs to be rejected. It's inaccurate in terms of what Paul is actually talking about in his text. Okay, so we're on the same side here, and I think it needs to be appreciated that Paul within Judaism scholars are doing this as well. Again, whether explicitly, which some of them do, or implicitly in their work. And it sort of goes without saying that we can agree that, the old perspective, the traditional reading of Paul, Lutheran reading, whatever you want to call it, justification theory is garbage. It needs to be rejected. So we're on the same team there, for sure. Now, I want to say a few things about why I remain unpersuaded by this interpretive proposal. As much as we share common ground, me coming from a sort of apocalyptic perspective, I remain unconvinced by any interpretative proposal that removes the extent to which Jesus does something ontological to humanity here and now. Let me say that again. I'm going to be skeptical of proposals that basically remove the extent to which Jesus does something ontological to humanity here and now. Why? You're not going to be able to make sense of a large chunk of his texts. And as an apocalyptic reader, I think those texts in question deliver the heart of what Paul was all about. Paul thinks that Jesus is the solution to death. And there is a sense in which we participate in that now, that solution. While we do have one foot, as it were, in the muck and mire of Adam, we're also given new minds to live out of Christ in our more meaningful resurrected location right now. Yes, we can lapse back into the flesh, but we don't have to. And we don't have to just wait until Jesus returns to live as resurrected people. So I think part of what has decentered, I think, this message in the sort of Paul within Judaism crowd is an overdetermination of Christ's imminent return as what's really motivating Paul. I think it's the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead already, and that Paul has met him, and that he now sees himself and his communities as presently located and acting in the risen Christ, that is actually doing the heavy lifting for him. Christ's resurrection doesn't just signal his future resurrection and that it's coming soon. It actually does something to us. We're part of it. We die and rise in the Messiah, here and now, which transforms our ontology in a way that will no longer sin and die. This makes sense, I think, of all of the textual data having to do with Paul's practical communal concerns, his ethics, and his understanding of who God is in a beautifully coherent and liberating way. And I don't think that the Paul within Judaism camp handles this sufficiently. Okay? Relatedly, I think this idea that Christ affects all of humanity and the cosmos ontologically really calls into question the PWJ claim that the Spirit really only needs to reformat pagans, since Jews are already God's adopted sons. And while I would never say for a moment that Israel is not adopted and not God's people, I think this reading from PWJ doesn't seem to make sense of something like the front end of Galatians 4, where Paul is talking about Jews and saying that even though you're a minor in the family, until the appointed time when the Spirit arrives beautifully and links you up to Christ, and so transforms you as well, allowing you to cry, Abba, Father, it doesn't seem to be able to handle something like that. I think it's pretty clear that everyone, for Paul, needs to be reformatted by Christ's Spirit. Now, my third reason, I guess, why I'm unconvinced, this is going back to the sort of soteriological avenues that this can go. One being the sort of two ways approach, which I'll tackle now. It's becoming increasingly less common, I think, the idea that Paul is giving two ways of salvation. This just doesn't seem to make sense of Paul's anguish in his heart about his kinspeople not responding to Christ. There just is no evidence from Paul that he thinks this way, that there's one route for Jews and another route for pagans. Paul expects salvation to occur through Christ alone. Now, even when it comes to the other kind of direction soteriologically that the PWJ can go, which I think is the vast majority of advocates go this way, even if we go the way that says Jews are not saved apart from the agency of God's Messiah, and that there's a remnant of Israel chosen by God that stands sort of as a sign that soon the fullness of the nations will come in, at which point the rest of Israel will come in, who are presently broken off, and they get returned. All Israel is saved, all of that. The problem is that the Jewish branches are presently broken off because of unbelief. Paul is not asking Israel just to remain Israel until Jesus returns without any sort of response to him in the meantime. Paul expects the Jews, along with everybody else, to respond to Christ, which is why he's so upset in Romans 9 through 11, okay? So for him, a response to Christ is required on some level for everyone, including Jews, but he believes that this will in fact happen, and all Israel will be saved, okay? So I don't think the PWJ has sufficiently addressed this issue either. So my final point of why I remain unconvinced. I have a hard time with the way that the PWJ centers the synagogue for Paul's missionary activity, because I don't think Paul does. Yeah, he does use Jewish synagogues in their networks, but it's not at all clear that these were really all that successful. And this approach seems to overlook the way that Paul connected with lots of other networks that appeared to be overwhelmingly successful more often, okay? From family, aristocratic, patron, artisan friendship, even possibly military, to make his way around the Mediterranean. So to limit Paul's activity to sort of synagogue communities seems a little bit odd to me. So those are sort of the key reasons why I remain unconvinced. There are more, but I wanted to keep this video short, or at least on the shorter side. If you have any questions or pushbacks on the way that I described Paul within Judaism, please let me know in the comments. Please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. And if you'd like to support us in another way, you can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/apocalypse here, and check out the different benefits that are available to support us there. And with that, this has been Apocalypse here, Christianity you can live with.